What if I told you Columbus wasn't the first outsider to reach the Americas? What if the real story is that Africans, Moors from North Africa and Spain, sailed here hundreds of years before 1492, trading, building, and leaving behind evidence that's been deliberately ignored or erased? That single idea demolishes everything you were taught about discovery. Because if Moors were here first, then the entire foundation of American history has to be rewritten from the ground up. Let's cut straight into it. By the 8th century, the Moors had already mastered navigation. They controlled Spain, Portugal, and much of North Africa. They possessed advanced maps, star charts, and ship designs that Europe wouldn't catch up with for centuries. Historians openly admit the Moors could cross the Mediterranean with ease. But here's the kicker. Records suggest they crossed the Atlantic too, long before Columbus ever dreamed of sailing west. Take the writings of al-Masudi, a 10th century Arab historian. He described voyages across a sea of darkness, what we now call the Atlantic. He even recorded Moors who sailed west and returned with stories of new lands filled with strange peoples. Later, in the 1300s, Mansa Musa's brother, Abu Bakr II of Mali, is said to have led a fleet of hundreds of ships westward into the unknown. Where did they go? The Americas. Scholars dismiss it, but native oral histories in places like Mexico and the Caribbean specifically mention dark-skinned men who came from the east in great boats. Coincidence or deliberately buried history? Archaeology adds serious weight to this. Stone carvings in Mexico display unmistakably African features: thick lips, broad noses, dating centuries before Columbus arrived. The famous Olmec heads. Mainstream scholars wave them off as stylized, but look at them. They look African, period. And what about the presence of Old World crops in the New World before Columbus? Traces of plants like cotton and certain banana varieties show up in pre-Columbian soil samples. How did they cross entire oceans unless people physically brought them? Now here's where the story gets twisted. Columbus himself admitted he wasn't the first. In his own journals, he wrote that the people of Hispaniola told him dark-skinned people had come from the south and east, trading with spears tipped in metal, not native to the island. Columbus collected some of those spears, sent them back to Spain, and they were confirmed to be made of West African alloys. That's a smoking gun, and it's in Columbus's own words. So why don't we learn this in school? Why does every textbook still open with Columbus discovered America? Because admitting Africans arrived first means tearing down the lie that Europe brought civilization to the New World. It means admitting Africa wasn't a continent of backward tribes, but a center of science, exploration, and global power. And that doesn't fit the colonial story. Erasing the Moors erases the proof that black people shaped global history long before slavery ever began. But let's step back. Who exactly were these Moors that supposedly touched America first? They were North Africans, Berbers, Arabs, and Black Africans who spread into Spain in 711 AD. They built universities, mapped the stars, and developed technologies that Europe later borrowed during the Renaissance. By the 1400s, Moorish sailors had access to maps showing the Americas. Maps like the Piri Reis chart, which mysteriously depicted parts of South America with shocking accuracy before Columbus supposedly found them. Were those maps based on Moorish voyages? Evidence points to yes. And here's a detail most people completely miss. The very ships Columbus used, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, were designed using Moorish naval knowledge. The word caravel, the style of ship Columbus sailed, comes straight from Arabic. Without Moorish designs, Columbus never would have made it across. Think about that. Even the so-called discovery of America rests entirely on Moorish science. So what does this mean? It means the idea of Columbus as a lone genius explorer is a carefully constructed myth. It means African navigators had already crossed, traded, and maybe even settled in parts of the Americas long before Spain funded Columbus's voyage. And it means African presence in the New World didn't start with slavery. It started with exploration, science, and power. And that's where things get even wilder. Because if the Moors reached the Americas before Columbus, then traces of their presence should still be here. Architecture, language, cultural echoes, signs that point to who was really first. And as we'll see in the next part, those traces are hiding in plain sight across the Americas, buried under centuries of deliberate lies. So let's follow the trail. The question isn't whether the Moors got here first. The question is, how much of their presence is still with us today? If the Moors really crossed the Atlantic before Columbus, then they had to leave something behind. Ideas vanish, but stones, artifacts, and culture remain. And when you look closely, the Americas are absolutely filled with fingerprints that don't match the official story. Let's start with the Olmecs. These were one of the earliest major civilizations in Mexico, flourishing between 1200 and 400 BC, long before Columbus. Their most famous relics are the colossal stone heads, weighing up to 40 tons, scattered across sites like La Venta and San Lorenzo. Scholars insist they represent local rulers. But here's the problem. Their features: broad noses, full lips, rounded faces. They don't look like the people usually depicted in Mesoamerican art. They look African. The explanation given by mainstream archaeology? Coincidence. But how many coincidences do we allow before calling it evidence? Move further south. In Panama and Honduras, indigenous oral histories speak of strangers who came in great boats, dark-skinned men with thick hair who traded goods and taught farming techniques. These stories predate Columbus by centuries. Oral traditions aren't random. They're cultural memory. When the same types of stories appear across separate regions, they form a pattern that demands explanation. Now consider language. In several Native American tongues, words appear that have no obvious origin in the Americas, but closely resemble West African languages. For example, words in Mandinka echo through the Arawak language family in the Caribbean. Scholars dismiss it as chance similarities. But when those same Caribbean tribes told Columbus they had already traded with black men from the East, chance stopped sounding convincing. Let's talk about metal. Archaeologists in Central America have uncovered alloys that match metallurgical techniques from West Africa, particularly a mix of gold and copper known as guanin. In fact, when Columbus landed, the Taino people handed him spears tipped with guanin. Tests revealed the alloy contained the exact composition used in West Africa at the time: 32 parts gold, 18 parts silver, and the rest copper. Identical. Did that just happen randomly across the ocean? Or is it proof of direct contact? And we can't ignore maps. European cartographers of the 14th and 15th centuries somehow had knowledge of coastlines in the Americas before Columbus's voyage. How? Historians admit many of those maps came from Moorish and Islamic sources. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, but based on earlier documents, shows South America's coastline with startling accuracy. Accuracy that suggests someone had already been there to chart it, and the Moors are the most likely candidates. Here's something even stranger: architecture. Some temples in Mexico and Central America use construction methods strikingly similar to North African and even Egyptian techniques. Step pyramids with precise angles, mortarless stone fitting so exact you can't slide a blade between blocks. Why does New World architecture echo Old World genius? Scholars argue parallel development. But if we already have evidence of contact, the simpler explanation is influence. Now let's address the skeptics. They'll say, but where are the Moorish cities? Where are the shipwrecks? Where are the bones? The truth is, contact doesn't always mean colonization. The Moors may not have stayed long enough to build vast settlements. Their voyages could have been trade missions, leaving behind goods, knowledge, and stories rather than empires. Just because we don't see Moorish cities doesn't mean they weren't here. Think about the Vikings. For centuries, scholars dismissed Viking presence in North America as myth, until L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland was discovered in the 1960s. Overnight, impossible became proven. The Moorish trail works the same way. The puzzle pieces exist. The African features on Olmec heads, the Guanan spears, the oral histories, the maps, the crops. Each piece alone might be questioned. Together, they form a mosaic that's impossible to deny. And here's the bigger picture. Why does this matter? Because it challenges the idea that Africa was isolated, powerless, and waiting for Europe. The evidence says Africa was global, connected, and advanced. The Moors weren't passengers in history. They were drivers. Recognizing their role doesn't just correct the past. It forces us to rethink the roots of the Americas themselves. But this is just the surface, because the most striking evidence isn't in stone heads or ancient maps. It's in the cultures still alive today. Music, rituals, and spiritual traditions in the Americas that echo Africa. How did those similarities survive unless the two worlds met long before slavery? That's what we'll explore next. Stoneheads and metal alloys are powerful clues, but culture is often the strongest evidence of contact. Ideas travel more easily than armies, and when two peoples meet, their traditions rub off on one another. That's what makes the echoes between African Moorish culture and the traditions of native peoples across the Americas so fascinating. Let's start with music. Across West Africa, rhythm isn't just entertainment, it's communication. Drums speak, call, and respond. Patterns guide ceremonies, battles, and everyday work. Now look at indigenous music in the Caribbean and Central America. Long before Columbus, you find call and response structures, polyrhythms, and instruments strikingly similar to African drums and rattles. Anthropologists shrug and call it coincidental development. But when Columbus landed in Hispaniola, he noted that the people there used drums almost identical to those of West Africa. How do you explain that without contact? Then there's religion. Among the Moors, Islam was the dominant faith, but their African roots meant they also carried spiritual practices older than Islam. Traditions of ancestor veneration, ritual purification with water, and cosmologies tied to the stars. Across the Americas, you see parallels: purification rituals among native groups, reverence for ancestors, and cosmologies where stars guide agriculture and navigation. Were these just universal human patterns? Maybe. Or maybe they were carried, shared, and preserved across the Atlantic. Even more telling are specific symbols. In Moorish and West African culture, the crescent moon was a sacred emblem tied to cycles of time and faith. In Mesoamerica, the moon goddess and lunar symbols held central importance, often drawn with motifs eerily similar to Moorish crescents. Did the two civilizations develop lunar reverence independently? Possibly. But again, we're stacking coincidences on top of coincidences. Now think about food. West Africans cultivated and consumed crops like millet, sorghum, and yams. In the Americas, native peoples already had corn, beans, and squash. But in parts of the Caribbean and Brazil, archaeological records show African-style food preparation methods, mortars and pestles shaped exactly like those from West Africa, used in the same way. When cultural DNA appears across oceans, it suggests contact. Let's dig deeper into language. I mentioned earlier the Mandinka echoes in Caribbean tongues. In some Arawak languages, words for concepts like boat, gold, and even family structures resemble Mandinka words. Columbus himself recorded that the Arawaks told him they had already traded with men who came from the east in large canoes, dark-skinned people with long hair. If they were already familiar with such travelers, that would explain why their languages absorb new words. But it's not just about what the Moors may have given. It's also about what they may have taken back. Spices, plants, and stories could have flowed from the Americas to Africa long before Columbus. Scholars have debated for years how certain crops like maize, corn, appeared in Africa before Europeans were supposed to have introduced them. Moorish voyages provide one possible explanation. Now, skeptics will argue cultural similarities don't prove contact, and that's true in isolation. But when music, symbols, crops, and oral histories all point in the same direction, the case grows stronger. You don't need every piece of evidence to be a smoking gun. You just need the pattern, and the pattern screams connection. Here's what makes this powerful. It changes how we see the Americas before Columbus. We're taught that these continents were cut off, waiting to be discovered. But what if they were already in dialogue with Africa and the Moorish world? That makes the Americas part of a global network centuries before Europe admitted it. That means the so-called New World was never new. It was connected. And if the Moors carried knowledge, faith, and rhythm across the ocean, then part of what we call native culture today may actually be shared culture. African seeds planted in American soil. This doesn't diminish native achievements. It deepens them, showing how cultures meet, mix, and create something new. Here's the big twist. When slavery began centuries later, Africans brought to the Americas may have found pieces of their own culture already here. Imagine the shock of recognition, rhythms, symbols, foods, and words that felt familiar in a land they had never seen. That overlap isn't coincidence. It's history. Artifacts can be buried. Songs can be lost. But stories endure. And if the Moors truly crossed the Atlantic before Columbus, native peoples would have remembered them. Guess what? They did. Across the Americas, there are oral traditions of strangers from the East arriving in great boats. Not Europeans, not pale-skinned men in armor, but dark-skinned sailors who came bearing goods, knowledge, and sometimes kinship. These aren't fringe claims. They're recorded in missionary accounts, explorer journals, and even native stories passed down today. Let's start in the Caribbean. When Columbus arrived in 1492, the Taino people already knew about men who came from the East. They described them as dark-skinned with curly hair, arriving in large canoes laden with trade goods. Columbus himself wrote this down in his diary. This wasn't a myth created after contact. It was a memory the Taino already had. Who fits that description better than African Moors? Move north to the Mississippi Valley. Among some southeastern tribes, there are legends of dark-skinned visitors who taught new farming techniques and shared stories of lands far across the water. The Choctaw tell of a people who came by sea, dark in complexion, who mingled their blood with locals. Skeptics try to brush this off as later reinterpretations. But when different tribes in different regions tell similar stories, you have to ask, are they all imagining the same thing? In Mexico, the Olmec civilization left us those massive stone heads I mentioned earlier, unmistakably African in appearance. But beyond stone, there are legends of gods or visitors arriving from the east by water. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, is sometimes described as pale. Yes, but in other traditions, he's simply a wise teacher from across the sea. Another figure, Solotl, is described in certain oral accounts as dark-skinned and foreign, yet bringing knowledge of calendars and cultivation. Then there's South America. The Mandinka, a people of West Africa, have long told their own story of crossing the Atlantic under Mansa Abu Bakr II. But on the American side, certain native groups in Brazil and along the Amazon tell of visitors arriving by sea generations before Europeans. They're described as skilled navigators, darker than the local people, and bringing iron tools. Iron wasn't native to pre-Columbian South America. So where did that detail come from? Even in the far north, echoes appear. Among the Algonquin and Iroquois, stories exist of black people arriving in great boats. Some describe them as allies, others as traders. None describe them as pale or European. It's almost as if the memory of African seafarers had spread widely enough to be recorded in very different regions. Here's where it gets even more compelling. Many of these stories don't glorify conquest. They don't speak of violence, enslavement, or domination like later European encounters. Instead, they talk about exchange of goods, ideas, even marriages. That aligns perfectly with what we know about the Moors. They weren't just conquerors. They were merchants, scholars, navigators. They built bridges between cultures, not walls. And remember, oral history isn't less reliable than written records. For many indigenous nations, oral tradition was the archive. Stories were preserved with strict accuracy, recited word for word across generations. Western historians dismissed these accounts for centuries, preferring European documents. But now, as scholars revisit oral traditions with fresh eyes, they're finding remarkable accuracy. Descriptions of natural disasters, migrations, and celestial events that line up perfectly with scientific evidence. If oral tradition can preserve a volcanic eruption from 1,000 years ago, why not a visit from African seafarers 600 years ago? Of course, critics argue these are coincidences, or worse, later inventions influenced by post-Columbian encounters. But here's the question. Why would multiple tribes, separated by thousands of miles, invent the same memory of dark-skinned visitors? Why would they describe boats larger than anything they themselves built, unless they had seen them? And here's the kicker. These memories survived despite centuries of colonization, forced assimilation, and suppression of native culture. European missionaries tried to erase them. Schools punished native children for speaking their languages, yet the stories endured, all of them. That alone makes them worth listening to. Now let's connect the dots. We've seen stone heads that look African. We've seen maps that hint at pre-Columbian voyages. We've seen cultural echoes in music, food, and faith. And now we have oral traditions, living voices, remembering contact. Put them together, and the weight of evidence grows too strong to dismiss. But what about the Moors themselves? Did they leave behind any written record of their journeys? The answer is yes. Scattered, overlooked, but there. In Arabic chronicles and Moorish accounts, there are references to great voyages west, to lands rich with gold and people, to journeys across the sea of darkness. These aren't just legends. They're historical breadcrumbs waiting to be connected to the native stories we've just explored. And that's where we're headed next, into the Moorish side of the story, because the natives remembered them. But did the Moors record their own journeys? Oh, the surprising answer is absolutely. If native peoples remembered dark-skinned sailors arriving before Columbus, then logic demands we look at the other side of the ocean. Did the Moors themselves ever record such voyages? The answer, though scattered across archives and often ignored by mainstream historians, is yes. The Moors were not only scientists, scholars, and rulers, they were seafarers, and they left clues. Let's start in West Africa, the hub of Moorish influence after centuries of Islamic expansion. One of the most intriguing accounts comes from Mali, under the reign of Mansa Abu Bakr II in the early 1300s. Arab chroniclers, especially al-Umari, recorded that Abu Bakr wasn't content with ruling one of the richest kingdoms on earth. He believed the Atlantic Ocean led to other lands. He commissioned a fleet of 200 ships, each stocked with men, food, and gold, to explore what lay beyond. Only one ship returned. Its captain reported that the others had vanished into a powerful current. Abu Bakr was so convinced there was land across the ocean that he abdicated his throne, leaving it to his brother, Mansa Musa, and personally set sail with another fleet. This time, 2,000 ships. He never returned. Now pause. If this sounds like fantasy, think again. Oceanographers confirm there's a transatlantic current system, the Canary Current, flowing west from Africa that would carry ships directly toward the Americas. A fleet leaving West Africa could easily have been pushed into the Caribbean or South America. So when native oral traditions mention strangers arriving in great boats, this dovetails perfectly with Abu Bakr's story. But Mali wasn't the only player. Moorish Spain had its own Atlantic explorers. Arabic sources mention seafarers venturing beyond the Sea of Darkness, the term used for the Atlantic. One account describes 8 brothers, the Mugararin, who sailed from Lisbon, were caught in currents, and reached islands far across the ocean. Another tells of Moorish sailors landing on unknown shores, where they met dark-skinned people who were not Africans. Some scholars dismiss these accounts as legends, but others see them as veiled records of early transatlantic contact. Then there are the maps. We've already talked about the Piri Reis map of 1513, which shows the Americas with uncanny accuracy, supposedly based on earlier Moorish and Arab charts. But even before Piri Reis, cartographers in Islamic Spain were mapping lands across the Atlantic. Al-Idrisi, the great 12th century geographer, compiled maps that included mysterious islands west of Africa. These were not simply guesses. Al-Idrisi gathered information from sailors, traders, and Moorish navigators who had ventured far beyond the Mediterranean. One particularly fascinating record comes from the writings of Ibn Khaldun, the famous Arab historian of the 14th century. While discussing the ambitions of rulers, he casually mentions voyages undertaken across the Atlantic in search of new lands. Though he provides little detail, his matter-of-fact tone suggests this was not outlandish at the time. It was part of the known ambitions of great rulers. Now think about the implications. If Abu Bakr truly launched a fleet of thousands, do we really believe not a single ship made landfall? Even if most were lost, all it would take is one or two to reach the Americas. Survivors could have mingled with local peoples, left behind knowledge, crops, or even bloodlines. That might explain why native oral traditions consistently recall strangers arriving from the East. Skeptics argue, if the Moors reached the Americas, why don't we see clear Arabic writing or Islamic artifacts everywhere? But archaeology isn't that neat. Moors traveling across would not necessarily bring Qurans carved in stone. They would bring tools, crops, and techniques. And remember, survivors might not have built mosques, but instead assimilated, sharing knowledge of navigation, agriculture, or metallurgy. What we do see are anomalies, African-looking statues, old world plants appearing in pre-Columbian contexts, and oral stories that fit perfectly. Even Columbus himself admitted he wasn't first. In his letters, he wrote that the native people of Hispaniola told him of dark-skinned traders arriving from the south and east, bringing metal-tipped spears made of an alloy similar to African metallurgy. Columbus didn't invent this. He recorded what he was told. It suggests contact was remembered by the locals, and the descriptions align with what the Moors or West Africans would have carried. Add to this the linguistic breadcrumbs. In some native languages, words appear that resemble Arabic or Mandinka roots, particularly in the Caribbean. While not definitive, the overlaps are enough to raise eyebrows among linguists willing to look beyond Eurocentric assumptions. Here's the bigger picture. Moorish society was outward-looking. They built trade networks across the Sahara, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean. Why wouldn't they push westward into the Atlantic? They had the ships, the maps, the ambition. And when rulers like Abu Bakr poured resources into exploration, they weren't just gambling. They were building on centuries of Moorish navigation expertise. So where does this leave us? We have native oral traditions describing black visitors. We have Arab chroniclers describing Moorish voyages. We have maps with American coastlines drawn before Columbus. And we have Columbus himself recording native memories of black traders. When you connect the dots, the conclusion becomes hard to avoid. The Moors didn't just dream of crossing the Atlantic, they did it. And this raises the next question. If they made contact, what exactly did they bring with them? What knowledge, crops, or technologies crossed that ocean before 1492? That's what we'll explore in the next part. The cultural fingerprints of the Moors in the Americas. If the Moors truly set foot in the Americas before Columbus, then their presence should have left fingerprints, clues that can't be ignored. And when you start looking, those fingerprints are everywhere, in language, in architecture, in crops, and even in the faces of the people who were already here when Europeans arrived. Let's start with language. When the Spanish began their conquest of the New World, they recorded words used by indigenous groups that seem strangely familiar. For example, early explorers in the Caribbean noted words like canoa, canoe, and maize, maize. But some other terms appear with echoes of Arabic. The Moors had ruled Spain for over 700 years, and Arabic words made their way deep into Spanish vocabulary. Words like azúcar, sugar, aceituna, olive, and algebra. When Spanish scribes heard indigenous people using similar sounding terms, it raised the question, were these coincidences or remnants of Moorish African contact? Architecture tells an even louder story. In parts of Mexico and South America, explorers stumbled upon structures with arches, domes, even geometric tile patterns that looked eerily similar to Islamic designs from Andalusia and North Africa. One of the clearest examples is in the Yucatan, where certain Mayan sites display keyhole arches that bear a striking resemblance to Moorish ones. Now, skeptics say these similarities could be explained by coincidence, that civilizations can invent similar shapes independently. But when you stack the evidence, the patterns, the proportions, the decorative flourishes, the line between coincidence and influence begins to blur. And then there's agriculture. Crops tell the story of migration better than almost anything else. The Moors were masters of irrigation and crop adaptation. They transformed Spain's agriculture by introducing rice, citrus fruits, sugarcane, and cotton, plants that had African and Middle Eastern origins. Now here's the kicker. Sugarcane shows up in the Americas before Columbus could have introduced it on a large scale. Cotton varieties in the New World bear striking genetic similarities to African strains. Could they have crossed the Atlantic by natural drift? Possibly, but the presence of advanced irrigation techniques in the Americas, systems that mirrored Moorish engineering in Spain, suggests something else. Knowledge traveled here, and if knowledge made the crossing, people almost certainly did too. The faces of indigenous Americans also carry part of the story. Accounts from early Spanish explorers describe native groups with features they considered foreign, darker skin tones, tightly curled hair, or even names that carried echoes of Semitic or African roots. In Panama, Vasco Núñez de Balboa wrote of meeting people who seemed to resemble the Moors of Spain. In Brazil, similar accounts appear. Again, skeptics dismiss this as misinterpretation, but stacked alongside the other evidence, it paints a compelling picture. Contact wasn't just possible, it was real. Trade routes add more fuel to the fire. Moorish sailors were already masters of Atlantic currents. They knew the winds that carried ships from West Africa toward the Americas and back again, the same winds Columbus would later use. In fact, maps recovered from Moorish Spain appear to show land masses across the Atlantic that resemble the Americas. The famous Piri Reis map of 1513, drawn by an Ottoman admiral, included coastlines of South America with shocking accuracy, at a time when Europeans supposedly hadn't explored those regions yet. Where did that knowledge come from? Oral traditions among Moors and Africans speak of great voyages westward long before Columbus set sail. Even religion offers hints. Some indigenous groups practiced rituals that mirrored Islamic customs. The Mandinka people, known for their maritime skills, are believed to have traveled to the Americas before 1492, carrying with them not just goods but also faith traditions. Spanish chroniclers noted indigenous prayers and fasting practices that felt strangely familiar, resembling elements of Islam. Could it be coincidence? Maybe. Or it could be cultural memory preserved through centuries of quiet contact. The most startling evidence comes from Columbus himself. In his journals, Columbus admitted that when he landed in the Caribbean, he encountered people who told him of black men who had come from the South and Southeast, trading with golden-tipped spears. Those spears, when tested, were found to contain alloys identical to those used in West Africa. That means Africans, possibly Moors, were already trading with the Americas before Columbus ever arrived. So why isn't this history widely accepted? Because it rewrites the foundation of the so-called Age of Discovery. If the Moors, Africans, or Muslims reached the Americas first, then Columbus isn't the hero he's painted as. He's just the man who showed up late and claimed the prize. That's a dangerous truth for the narrative of Western supremacy. And it's why these fingerprints are so often ignored, dismissed, or buried. But they're there, in the words, in the crops, in the architecture, in the maps, and in the very people themselves. The story of America doesn't begin with Columbus. It begins centuries earlier, when Moorish ships cut across the Atlantic, carrying knowledge, faith, and traditions that would quietly shape the New World. And in the next part, we'll go deeper, looking at how specific Moorish voyages westward are documented, and how rulers in Africa were actively exploring long before Europe caught up. When people hear that the Moors or Africans might have reached the Americas before Columbus, they usually say the same thing. If that were true, wouldn't it be in the history books? The truth is, it is in the records. You just have to know where to look. The problem isn't that the evidence doesn't exist. The problem is that it's been deliberately minimized or ignored, because acknowledging it changes the whole story of discovery. One of the strongest pieces of evidence comes from West Africa in the 14th century. The ruler of the Mali Empire, Mansa Abu Bakr II, is said to have launched a massive expedition westward across the Atlantic. According to accounts recorded by Arab historians, Abu Bakr built a fleet of hundreds of ships staffed with sailors, navigators, and supplies, determined to explore the unknown waters. The story goes that he sent out an initial fleet of 200 ships, and only one returned, reporting that the others were swallowed by a powerful current. Instead of giving up, Abu Bakr doubled down. He built an even larger fleet, said to be 2,000 ships, and personally led it out into the Atlantic around the year 1311. What happened to that fleet? Mainstream historians claim it probably sank, or that it was lost to storms. But oral traditions in the Americas hint at something else. Native accounts in the Caribbean and South America describe the arrival of strange men from the East who came in large ships and brought with them goods made of gold and cloth, unlike anything they had seen before. Some even intermarried with local populations. Archaeologists have found traces of West African metals and inscriptions in South America that suggest the presence of these travelers. And here's the kicker. Columbus himself knew these stories. In his writings, Columbus admitted that people in the Americas had told him of black men who had visited before, bringing goods and weapons tipped with gold. Tests later revealed that the gold in those weapons matched alloys used in West Africa. Columbus didn't dismiss the reports. In fact, he seemed to use them as confirmation that he was not the first to cross the Atlantic. The Mandinka people, known as sailors and traders across the Sahara and Atlantic, are often linked to these voyages. They were master navigators, using the stars, wind patterns, and currents to travel long distances. Remember, the same Atlantic currents that carried Columbus's ships westward in 1492 were already well known to African sailors. The Canary Current and the North Equatorial Current form a natural highway from West Africa to the Americas. To say Africans couldn't have made the trip is to ignore the basic geography of the ocean itself. Evidence isn't just in stories, it's in artifacts. In Brazil, inscriptions have been found in stone that resemble West African writing styles. In Mexico, terracotta figures with distinctly African features have been unearthed, dating back centuries before Columbus. And across Central and South America, indigenous oral traditions recall encounters with seafaring visitors who came in great ships from the east. Skeptics argue that currents alone can't prove intentional voyages. But the Moors and Africans weren't drifting aimlessly. They had advanced shipbuilding technologies, from lateen sails perfected during the Moorish rule of Spain to large ocean-worthy vessels used for trade along the African coast. When the Moors crossed into Europe in 711, they did so with fleets capable of carrying armies across the Mediterranean. Scaling up those skills for Atlantic voyages wasn't an impossible leap. It was a natural progression. The story of Abu Bakr's voyage is particularly disruptive to the Eurocentric timeline of exploration. If an African emperor launched a successful fleet to the Americas in 1311, then Columbus's discovery in 1492 becomes a footnote, not a beginning. European conquest would be reframed, not as the first encounter between the old world and the new, but as a violent takeover of an already established connection. Even more intriguing are the reports of Moors traveling with Columbus himself. Historians have noted that some of his sailors were of African descent, skilled in navigation and ship handling. This makes sense. Spain had only expelled the Moors in 1492, the same year Columbus set sail. Their expertise in sailing, mathematics, and cartography was unmatched. To think Columbus set out without relying on that knowledge is wishful thinking at best. Another overlooked clue is the Piri Reis map of 1513, drawn by an Ottoman admiral. The map depicts parts of South America and even Antarctica with shocking accuracy, despite Europeans supposedly not exploring those areas yet. The admiral himself claimed he based his map on older charts, some drawn by Moors. This suggests that Moorish navigators had mapped parts of the Americas long before Europeans made them public. So why isn't this taught in schools? Because it undermines the central myth of Western history, that Europe alone carried the torch of exploration, science, and civilization. If Africans, led by a ruler like Abu Bakr, reached the Americas first, then the narrative of European superiority collapses. The real story would be one of cultural exchange, where African and indigenous people had contact long before Europeans rewrote the script. And here's the most important point. These voyages weren't just about exploration. They were about connection. The Moors and West Africans didn't arrive with armies to conquer. They arrived with trade goods, technology, and culture. The artifacts, the metals, the oral histories all point to encounters marked more by exchange than by domination. That makes the contrast with Columbus even starker. Where Africans may have come as partners, Europeans came as colonizers. If Abu Bakr's voyage is remembered, if African seafarers are acknowledged, then history shifts from one of European triumph to one of African innovation and lost legacy. That's why this story matters. It isn't just about who arrived first. It's about whose story gets told and whose gets buried. And in the next part, we'll uncover how Columbus himself leaned on Moorish knowledge and why his journey in 1492 wouldn't have been possible without the science, navigation, and maps developed under African influence. We're told that Christopher Columbus was some kind of lone genius, a daring visionary who defied the skeptics to discover a new world. But peel back the layers of myth, and another picture emerges. Columbus was not innovating, he was borrowing. And most of what he borrowed, navigation, mathematics, astronomy, even the ships themselves, came directly from the Moors. Without Moorish science and knowledge, Columbus would never have left Spain's shores, much less crossed the Atlantic. Start with geography. By 1492, the Moors had ruled much of Spain for nearly 800 years. During that time, they transformed the Iberian Peninsula into a center of knowledge unmatched in Europe. Cordoba, Granada, and Seville boasted libraries with hundreds of thousands of volumes on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and cartography. Universities thrived where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars studied side by side. It was in this environment that the sciences Columbus depended on were preserved, translated, and expanded. Take navigation. The astrolabe, a device used to measure the position of the stars to determine latitude, was refined by Moorish astronomers. The quadrant, another essential navigation tool, was brought into Europe through Moorish Spain. Even the mathematical tables Columbus used to chart his course westward were drawn from Arabic sources. Columbus wasn't charting unknown seas blindly. He was following a map of knowledge built largely by the very people Spain had just expelled. And let's talk about maps. One of the biggest secrets of Columbus's voyage is that he carried with him maps that were far more advanced than anything Christian Europe should have had at the time. Moorish and Arab geographers like Al-Idrisi in the 12th century had created incredibly detailed maps of the known world. Al-Idrisi's Tabula Rogeriana showed Europe, Africa, and Asia with astonishing accuracy for its time, and his work circulated widely through Moorish Spain. Columbus also had access to the work of scholars like Al-Farghani, whose writings on astronomy and geography influenced how Europeans calculated distances across the ocean. In fact, Columbus famously underestimated the distance to Asia because he selectively used Arab sources that supported his gamble. He claimed Asia was much closer than it really was, and the only reason his voyage succeeded at all was because the Americas happened to be in the way. Without that accident, his crews would have starved at sea. Now consider the ships themselves. The caravels that Columbus sailed, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, were not European inventions. Their design was directly influenced by Moorish shipbuilding. The lateen sail, a triangular sail that allowed ships to tack against the wind, was introduced to Europe by the Moors. This innovation gave ships unprecedented maneuverability and range. It was the lateen sail that allowed Columbus's caravels to ride the Atlantic currents and winds effectively. Strip away the Moorish influence, and his fleet would have been stuck hugging the coastlines like earlier European vessels. Even Columbus's knowledge of Atlantic winds and currents wasn't original. Moorish sailors had long studied the Canary Current and the North Equatorial Current, which create a natural loop between Africa, the Americas, and back to Europe. Arab and African traders used these currents for centuries in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Columbus wasn't blazing a new trail. He was sailing a road already mapped by others. But here's the irony. While Spain expelled the Moors in 1492, calling them infidels and outsiders, it turned around and relied on their knowledge to fuel exploration and empire. Columbus himself is rumored to have had African and Moorish sailors among his crew. Why? Because no one knew the seas better. The Spanish crown may have wanted to erase Moorish culture from Iberia, but when it came to venturing into the unknown, they quietly leaned on Moorish expertise. This dependency is rarely acknowledged because it undermines the heroic myth of Columbus. Imagine telling schoolchildren that the man credited with discovering America could not have done so without the people his sponsors had just driven out of Spain. Imagine admitting that the foundations of European exploration, the so-called Age of Discovery, were built on African and Arab science. That flips the narrative from one of European genius to one of European appropriation. The suppression of this truth is part of a broader pattern. Just as Egypt's African identity was whitened and the Moors' role in Europe's Renaissance was erased, so too was their contribution to the so-called discovery of the New World. Textbooks celebrate Columbus, but omit the intellectual scaffolding he stood on. They portray him as a lone visionary when, in reality, he was the beneficiary of centuries of African and Moorish innovation. Let's be clear. Columbus did not discover anything. Indigenous peoples were already living across the Americas, with civilizations more advanced in many ways than Europe at the time. But even the act of reaching the Americas wasn't a purely European achievement. It was the product of knowledge systems that stretched from Africa to the Middle East to Asia. The Moors acted as the bridge. Think about the symbolism of 1492. That was the year Granada, the last Moorish kingdom in Spain, fell to Ferdinand and Isabella. It was also the year Columbus set sail. One door closed, another open. Spain celebrated the conquest of the Moors while simultaneously cashing in on their legacy to expand overseas. It was erasure and exploitation in the same breath. This context changes how we understand the so-called age of exploration. It wasn't simply Europeans reaching out into the world for the first time. It was Europeans using Moorish science to propel themselves into global domination. The maps, the mathematics, the ships, the instruments, all were borrowed. What Europe added was conquest and colonization. In the next part, we'll dig deeper into the contradiction of 1492, while Spain was burning Moorish books and forcing conversions. It was also using Moorish knowledge as the launch pad for empire. This is the hidden foundation of European colonialism. Knowledge taken on January 2nd, 1492. Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs, accepted the surrender of Granada. This marked the end of Moorish rule in Spain. The Alhambra, the jewel of Islamic architecture, was handed over, and with it, centuries of Moorish science, art, and culture came under Christian control. Almost immediately, Spain began a systematic campaign to erase that legacy. Mosques were converted into churches, Arabic texts were burned, and Moors were forced to either convert to Christianity or leave. And yet, just months later, on August 3rd, 1492, Columbus set sail westward with the blessing and funding of the same monarchs. His ships carried not only sailors and supplies, but also the intellectual inheritance of the very people Spain was trying to erase. The contradiction is glaring. Spain wanted to wipe out Moorish culture at home while using Moorish knowledge abroad to build an empire. Consider what was happening at the Alhambra Palace that same year. After the Moors surrendered it, the Spanish crown issued the Alhambra Decree, expelling Jews from Spain. Libraries were raided, books in Arabic and Hebrew burned. Centuries of scholarship vanished in smoke. Yet in secret, many of the navigational and astronomical texts the Spanish crown held onto came from Moorish sources. The public message was clear. We are purifying Spain. The private reality was more pragmatic. We need this knowledge to conquer. This duality is the essence of 1492. The year is painted in history books as triumphant. The unification of Spain, the discovery of the New World, the start of Europe's golden age. But in reality, it was built on theft and erasure. Spain erased the Moors in Granada, but exploited their science at sea. Spain expelled Jews, but relied on Jewish financiers and cartographers to fund and guide expeditions. The very groups demonized at home became the backbone of Spain's global project abroad. Now let's talk about Columbus himself. He didn't stumble blindly across the ocean. He sailed with charts and astronomical data compiled from Moorish and Arab sources. He used caravels shaped by Moorish shipbuilding innovations. His crews likely included sailors of Moorish and African descent because Spain needed their expertise. Remember, the Canary Islands, just off the coast of Africa, had long been a base for Moorish and African sailors. Columbus's first stop on his voyage, the Canary Islands, where African knowledge of Atlantic currents was crucial. It's no coincidence that the very year Spain drove the Moors from Granada, Columbus set out west. The same forces of conquest and expansion were at play. The Reconquista, at home, and colonization abroad, were two sides of the same coin. Spain perfected domination in Iberia, conquering, expelling, erasing, and then exported that model to the Americas. Here's the part history books don't emphasize. Columbus's voyage wasn't just about discovery. It was about empire. An empire requires knowledge. Spain didn't generate that knowledge on its own. It took it from the Moors, from the Jews, from Africa. The so-called Age of Discovery was really the Age of Appropriation. This is why 1492 is such a pivotal year. It marks the deliberate silencing of non-European voices within Spain, while simultaneously using those same voices to launch European dominance abroad. It's like killing the goose but pocketing its golden eggs first. And the symbolism runs even deeper. The last act of Moorish Spain was the surrender of the Alhambra, a palace that symbolized beauty, science, and sophistication. The first act of Spain's empire was Columbus sailing into the Atlantic with Moorish knowledge hidden in his maps and instruments. One chapter closed, another open, but they were connected by a thread that history tried to cut out of the story. Why does this matter? Because when we're told that 1492 was the beginning of modern history, we're given only a half the story. We're shown the rise of Spain, but not the erasure of the Moors. We're taught Columbus's heroism, but not the knowledge he depended on. We're told the story of discovery, but not the story of theft. Without the Moors, there is no 1492 as we know it. Think about it. Spain emerged from the Reconquista with military power and political unity, but it lacked the intellectual tools to dominate the seas. Those tools had been preserved and advanced by the Moors for centuries. And while Spain tried to erase that legacy domestically, it carried it like contraband into its imperial ventures. This contradiction, erase and exploit, would define European colonialism for centuries. In the Americas, indigenous knowledge of crops, terrain, and medicine would be stolen while indigenous cultures were destroyed. In Africa, resources would be looted while people were enslaved. The pattern that began in 1492 never stopped. In the next part, we'll dig into how Spain used this Moorish inheritance to fuel not just Columbus's first voyage, but the entire machinery of the Atlantic slave trade. Because the fall of Granada and the rise of Columbus didn't just reshape maps, they reshaped human lives on a massive scale. And once again, the fingerprints of the Moors are all over it. When people talk about 1492, they almost always mention Columbus discovering the New World. What they forget is that the same year Columbus set sail, Spain had just conquered Granada, the last stronghold of the Moors. That victory didn't just give Spain land. It gave them access to Moorish knowledge that had been preserved and advanced in libraries, schools, and observatories for centuries. Think about the timing. Spain expelled the Moors in January. By August, Columbus was on the ocean, navigating with tools and maps that had been influenced by Moorish science. That's not a coincidence. It's cause and effect. The magnetic compass, the astrolabe, star charts. These weren't European inventions. They were refined and used by Muslims in North Africa and the Middle East, many of whom had Berber and Black African roots. Moorish Spain acted as a bridge, passing that science into European hands. Without it, Columbus would have been a sailor guessing at currents and directions. With it, he became the man who opened Europe's path to empire. But here's the twist. The very knowledge that once allowed African and Arab scholars to illuminate Europe became the same knowledge Europe later used to enslave and exploit millions of Africans. The compass that guided trade routes also guided slave ships. The mathematics developed in Moorish Cordoba, meant to calculate architecture and astronomy, also calculated cargo space for human beings in chains. Spain's rise as a global power was directly tied to its takeover of Moorish systems. Look at agriculture. The Moors had turned Iberia into a land of advanced irrigation, aqueducts, and crops. After the Reconquista, the Spanish adapted those systems and then exported them to the Americas. Sugar, cotton, and rice cultivation in the New World all followed models pioneered in Moorish Spain. But instead of being worked by free farmers and craftsmen, the fields were worked by enslaved Africans. Even the Spanish language carried Moorish fingerprints. Words like almacen, storehouse, acequia, irrigation ditch, and azúcar, sugar, came from Arabic. These weren't just words. They were technologies and methods that built colonial economies. So when Europeans planted sugar in the Caribbean, they were unknowingly extending Moorish knowledge into new lands. And let's talk about ships. The caravel, the nimble vessel that made ocean exploration possible, was inspired by designs the Portuguese learned through contact with Muslim shipbuilders along Africa's coast. Those innovations came from centuries of African and Arab experimentation with sails, hulls, and navigation in the Mediterranean and beyond. Without those advancements, transatlantic voyages would have been unthinkable in the 15th century. So Spain didn't simply conquer the Moors and move on. It absorbed their expertise and weaponized it. What had once been used to build multicultural centers of learning, like Cordoba and Granada, was retooled to fuel conquest, colonization, and slavery. Knowledge crossed the Strait of Gibraltar twice, first from Africa into Europe, then from Europe into the Americas. But when it crossed back, it returned as oppression. This is where the story gets even more layered. The Moors themselves were not strangers to slavery, but their systems were not based on race in the same way Europe's would become. In Moorish societies, slaves could be of many backgrounds, often war captives and manumission. Earning or being granted freedom was common. Some rose to high positions of power, but under Spain, slavery hardened into a racial caste system. If you were African, your skin defined your destiny. That brutal simplification marked a turning point in world history. And here's what few people connect. The Reconquista and the Age of Exploration are not two separate stories. They're chapters of the same book. The wealth Spain gained from taking Moorish cities, the confidence from military victory, and the knowledge systems they inherited all combined to launch their empire overseas. The fall of Granada made possible the rise of colonies in the Caribbean. The defeat of the Moors set the stage for the enslavement of millions of Africans. When Columbus claimed Hispaniola, he didn't just bring Spanish flags. He brought Moorish-influenced agriculture, architecture, and navigation. The very technologies the Moors had used to build flourishing societies in Spain were now tools of conquest in the Americas. And the people targeted for forced labor, Africans, were often kin to the same cultures that had given Europe this knowledge in the first place. It's one of the great ironies of history. The wisdom of African and Arab scholars helped Europe rise, only for Europe to turn around and enslave Africa. The compass, the ship, the irrigation system, these should have been legacies of collaboration. Instead, they became weapons of domination. So when we look at the so-called age of discovery, we need to strip away the myth. Columbus didn't sail into the unknown on sheer bravery. He sailed with Moorish science in his pocket. Spain didn't rise by accident. It rose because it conquered a civilization rich in knowledge, then repurposed that knowledge to build its empire. And that empire came at a cost, the beginning of centuries of racial slavery, exploitation, and erasure. Without the Moors, there would be no Columbus. Without Columbus, there would be no transatlantic slave trade. The chain of cause and effect is clear. The question we need to ask is this: how different would history look if the knowledge the Moors carried had been used to unite civilizations instead of divide them? We've spent this series uncovering what most history books never say. Europe didn't climb out of the so-called Dark Ages on its own. It was lifted by the knowledge, science, and culture of the Moors, Africans and Arabs, who built a civilization in Spain that became the bridge between the ancient and modern world. But here's the truth we can't ignore. The same knowledge that helped Europe rise was the same knowledge used to enslave, colonize, and suppress the very people it came from. Moorish irrigation became the backbone of plantation agriculture. Moorish astronomy and navigation became the tools of empire. Moorish medicine, mathematics, and architecture were absorbed, rebranded, and claimed as Western progress. And the people erased, written out of the story. When we think of the Renaissance, we're taught to imagine white European geniuses pulling themselves up out of darkness. We celebrate Da Vinci, Galileo, and Copernicus. But who talks about Ibn al-Haytham, the father of optics? Who mentions Averroes, whose commentaries on Aristotle shaped European philosophy? Who remembers al-Zarawi, the Moorish physician whose surgical tools and methods were copied for centuries? Erase the Moors, and Europe looks self-made. Restore the Moors, and the story shifts completely. Suddenly, Europe's golden age is revealed as an inheritance. Knowledge passed from Africa and the Islamic world, repackaged as European genius. And here's the part that stings. The erasure wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. After 1492, when Spain conquered Granada and expelled Jews and Muslims, it didn't just push people out. It burned libraries. It destroyed records. It rewrote memory. Europe wanted the knowledge, but not the acknowledgement of where it came from. That's why today, so few people know this story. That's why Moor has been reduced to a vague medieval enemy in Shakespeare, instead of recognized as a builder of Europe's foundations. But let's pull back and see the bigger picture. The Moors weren't just a footnote in European history. They were a turning point in world history. Without them, there would be no Columbus, no Renaissance, no so-called age of discovery. And without that, the modern world as we know it, its borders, its economies, its technologies would look unrecognizable. So when we talk about African contributions to civilization, we're not talking about side stories. We're talking about the main story. We're talking about the reason Europe rose when it did. We're talking about the African and Arab scholars who carried ancient wisdom through centuries of upheaval, only to see their legacy stolen and their people enslaved. And that leads to a question we have to face. What does it mean that the foundations of Western civilization were laid by those it later enslaved? What does it mean that Europe's power was built on African knowledge, but Africa was written out the credits? This isn't just about the past. It's about how we see the present. When people say Africa gave nothing to the world, they are repeating the lie that was crafted in the ashes of Moorish Spain. When people dismiss African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, or Africans as contributors to civilization, they are echoing the silence created by Europe's erasure. The truth is louder than the silence. And the truth is this: the Moors saved Europe from the Dark Ages. They lit the lamp of knowledge when Europe had forgotten how to strike the match. They preserved and expanded science, medicine, philosophy, art, and architecture. They carried the ancient world into the modern one. Without them, there is no Renaissance. Without them, there is no Europe as we know it. So the next time someone talks about Western civilization, remember this: it wasn't born in isolation. It was born in Cordoba, in Granada, in Timbuktu, in Cairo, in African and Islamic centers of learning that passed.